Oh, and if you want, you can go back, sit where you normally sit, or stay where you are. All right. Um, so tonight, uh, tonight is Freud, and it's like, all right, well, we need to talk about Freud, but I'm guessing if if you had any psychology class at all, you've probably learned about Freud already. So I'm going to try to give you some insights that maybe you didn't learn in the average psychology class. Just to go over what is available this week, there's theory notes, there's an old recorded lecture of Freud, there's a PowerPoint. There is a link to a CalU library films on demand. Sometimes these video links to our library, since it's been combined, are glitchy. If you cannot watch that, if it won't connect for you, don't panic. It's okay. You don't need to watch it. It's an extra film. It's bonus. You can talk about it in the discussion board, but you don't have to. But it's a nice film if it works for you. And then I do want you to watch the student sample, and that's a sample of the video you're going to create. They did it on Freud, so you kind of get to see what the video is like. If you were not present, if you were not on Zoom, so if you're watching this on D2L, and you did not get an assigned partner or theory, just email me, and once I get everybody's email that you need a partner, I will match you up and give you a theory. So don't worry, just email me, and I'll match you up. Okay, and you have many weeks to do this, so there's no rush. If I don't get to you immediately, I'll get to it this week before next class. And you will be set. Okay, and then the discussion board, we're going to talk a little bit about the way Freud and Jung did dream analysis, but I'm going to teach you how I do dream analysis. I want you to use my method of dream analysis and write about it for your discussion board. All right. So let me stop sharing. All right. So I gave you both the last week I gave you all the notes combined, but each week I also separate them. So like this week, you can click on notes on Freud. You don't have to search through the whole stack of notes. If you look in the notes, I threw in a cartoon. There's a dog laying on the couch, and it says the intrinsic problem with pet psychology or psychoanalysis, get off the couch. So, okay. So the first thing I'd like to say about Freud is basically Freud is easy to criticize, all right? And the criticism is valid, you know? So let me just list some of the valid criticism. You know, he was a white European male from upper class society who saw wealthy, young female clients. He focused on human sexuality too much. He decided to give his own interpretation of individuals using symbolism rather than allowing the client to find awareness themselves. He was a bit egotistical and chauvinistic. There was no equality or feminism or anything like that in his theory, and many more criticisms. A lot of his stages are probably not valid. And yet there are quite a few redeeming qualities. So yes, all of that is true. Here's the thing. Freud was one of the first, not the first, one of the first individuals to come up with two different types of theories. One was a developmental theory of a person's lifespan, and the second is psychoanalysis, dealing with individuals' emotions, psychosomatic symptomology, believing that people could be helped emotionally and psychologically. So for that time, just those two aspects of his larger theory was pretty revolutionary. And I think that it's important for us to place Freud in his historical context. So, yeah, all of those criticisms that I mentioned are valid. And yet, if you go back to that period in time, that's where everybody was at that time. It doesn't mean it's right. Even today, we have a lot of growing to do in our society with issues like equality and things like that, with more discoveries. So basically, understand the criticism, and anything that you don't like, leave it, but take what you do like. One of the things that I find very beneficial, and I see it all the time, is defense mechanisms. And I'm going to give you my own interpretation of a lot of the stages in his developmental theories. And, just from my experience with my own children. We have an entire class on human growth and development, and this was one of the first theories. As we move through the different theories, I put the theories in a specific order as they occurred in history. So as we learn about the theories, you're also learning about the history of psychology and counseling theory. So as we move through the theories, we're also moving through history. We're also moving from one location to another location. And basically, as we look at Freud, he was born in 1956, died in 1939. I think that when we think about that time period, he's a product of his times. He was usually, in the notes, I give you a little history about the person, their family, maybe some of their personal experiences, and then I move on to the attributes and aspects of their theory. So a little bit about Freud as a person. He was born in Freiburg, Moravia, which is now Czechoslovakia. But he moved to Vienna at the age of 4. So, he moved there very young. And so the first location where we're looking at psychological theories is Vienna. and specifically the University of Vienna, the medical school at that university, and it became so important in the origin of psychological theory that they call it the Vienna School of Thought. And so we have a number of individuals who came from Vienna or went to that university that moved into psychology. One of the interesting things about Freud is that he could have had one of the most comprehensive theories available today if he hadn't argued with his friends. So his friends were Adler and Erikson and Jung, and he was not only a mentor but a colleague of many famous psychologists, but each and every one of them eventually looked at the theory, applied his theory, but they came to the conclusion that it was missing something and that the theory could be improved if maybe it wasn't totally focused on human sexuality. Maybe it should be focused on interdynamics or other aspects of human nature. And if he would have included those suggestions in his theory, it would have simply become more comprehensive in nature. However, he rebuffed any suggestion, and he says, "Nope, you're wrong. I'm right. This is what the theory is going to be." Another school of thought that was taking place around this time period was in Paris. That school was known for basically coming up with and exploring various diagnoses. So, for instance, one of the physicians in the Paris School of Thought was Dr. Tourette's. And of course, he discovered Tourette's syndrome. So if you go to the University of Paris, they really began the development of diagnosis, and eventually it led to the DSM. But there was not a lot of treatment coming out of that school, not like it was in Vienna. So eventually, Freud ostracized all of his friends and stuck to himself, and his theory didn't grow or expand as it should have. So his family, he was born in a Jewish family. They fostered his intellectual interests, but they were somewhat limited in basically what they could do because of prejudice against Jewish people in that society. And so a lot of the males in Jewish families became either lawyers or doctors. And another reason for that is if they were trained in those areas and they had to move, they would take that degree and that knowledge with them, and they could practice those things anywhere they went. So it was a transferable knowledge. His father was quite an authoritarian figure in his life. He was very strict. He completed his medical degree from University of Vienna, and he also lectured there for 4 years later. He was only 26 years old at the time, so he was fairly young. And he devoted the rest of his life to developing his own theory of psychoanalysis and his own theory of the psychosexual stages of development. So one of the things that happened was when he was late 30s, early 40s, he began to develop a lot of psychosomatic symptomology. And so if we think about that word, soma means body, psyche means mind. So when you put those two things together, it's physical symptoms in our bodies that cannot be explained by an illness or injury, and they are most likely caused by our minds. So that's why he called them psychosomatic symptoms. But he was experiencing his own psychosomatic symptomology. He had upset stomach, he had anxiety, he had headaches, he was not sleeping well, he started having vivid dreams. And so he decided to explore this avenue because he was experiencing the symptomology himself. He also began to have a lot of phobias and a fear of death. So he was experiencing death anxiety in his life. So he started exploring these vivid dreams he was having, and he applied along with his friend Jung. Jung did a lot of dream analysis as well. And they decided that images in our dreams are actually symbols for aspects of our lives that have not been resolved in some way. That's all well and good. However, what my dreams may symbolize for me may not be the same for somebody else. We've all had different life experiences. We're all unique individuals. So even though Jung and Freud wrote books on the symbolism of dreams, you can still buy them at Barnes and Noble, they are vastly inaccurate. But he thought they were accurate for himself, so why wouldn't they be accurate for everybody? So let me just talk a little bit about a different perspective on dream analysis that I use. So I think that dreams are important, and dreams are our way of either processing things that have happened in our lives or trying to find solutions to things that are creating anxiety in our lives. And so I don't assign meaning to symbolism. But if a client tells me that they've either had a lucid dream is a vivid dream. When you wake up, you think it actually happened. So if you've ever seen that old horror movie, Nightmare on Elm Street, with Freddy Krueger, those were vivid dreams, lucid dreams. Sometimes clients have vivid or lucid dreams. They think they actually happened. But another type of dream that is very important is a recurring dream, a dream that we have over and over again for many nights. They're also dreams that we remember. So if you think you don't dream, it's just that you don't remember your dreams. So those are the two types of dreams that clients usually bring up. And I ask them to tell me in great detail what happened in their dream. And they walk me through the dream story. And then immediately after they finish sharing that dream with me, I ask them, okay, thank you for sharing that dream with me. While you were expressing what happened in that dream, or when you were experiencing the dream, what feelings were you having? What feelings were you experiencing in the dream? So let's say they were being chased by some giant monster and it felt overwhelming and they felt helpless and terrified. Well, I'm not going to say oh, well, that giant monster symbolizes such and such. I'm going to pull out the most significant feelings that they were experiencing while they were having that dream. And so they felt fear. They felt as though they were being chased, or a feeling of helplessness. And then I say, okay, so let's take those two important feelings. Are you experiencing those feelings in your current life in any way? So 9 times out of 10, they are. If it's a vivid dream or a recurring dream, it's not that they're being chased by a monster, but there's something going on in their lives that is creating a sense of fear and helplessness. And by sharing that dream and them coming up with a feeling in their real life, they're actually identifying their own symbolism. So I don't interpret it, I facilitate awareness that they create themselves. And so what that does, it provides the topic of counseling. It gives us some place to start. Well, let's talk about this part of your life that's resulting in fear, anxiety, helplessness. That's a good place to start. And maybe they wouldn't have brought that issue up immediately in a session, but coming at that issue through a dream is also often a very nice way, a nice segue into what their issue really is. That's what I want you to try to do in the discussion board for this week. Do that with your own dreams. It doesn't have to be a current dream. It could be maybe a dream you had in your past over and over again, maybe a lucid dream that you remember. If you don't have any, ask a friend or a member of your family. It should be an interesting topic for your discussion board, and it should be kind of fun. All right, so that's my take on dreams. I don't think that we can interpret anything for our client. I think it is our responsibility to facilitate client awareness so that they can provide their own meaning, and we can help them to process that meaning therapeutically in the sessions. All right, so another interesting thing is that for a long time as a young child, Freud had a nanny who took care of him. And remember, Freud was from a Jewish family, and the father was very strict. And Freud really cared about this nanny. They spent a lot of time together. She was his caregiver, but she was also Catholic. And she would take him to church, and she would read him things in the Bible and all that kind of stuff. And then unexpectedly, we are guessing that the father found out about this and she was fired. He was told by his father that she had stolen something. But for a long time, Freud experienced an emotional conflict between the father's religion and the authoritarianism, and the loving nanny and her religion. And there was this emotional conflict between the two. As Freud grew older, he began to look at this conflict. He began to identify how his father's authority affected him growing up. And he saw this emotional conflict, or any emotional conflict, but specifically this one, as a neuroses. And so that's why he believes that any religious belief is actually a neuroses. instead of some type of faith belief. Yeah, so he worked with a lot of famous people, Jung, Adler, Erickson, many others. So let's look at his theory a little bit. So we talked a little bit about his contributions to the field. We have we have his psychosexual stages of development. We have psychoanalysis. We have defense mechanisms, which I think are fairly accurate still today. And he was also one of the first individuals to look at the structure of our personalities. So he looked at id, ego, and superego. And when I was younger, everybody had seen the movie Animal House. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but in the movie, there's a young man, and he joins a fraternity, and he really likes a female and that he met, and to impress her, he invites her to the fraternity party. She drinks too much, and he has to make an ethical decision. He has to figure out what he's going to do. And it's really a struggle between the id and the superego. So on one of his shoulders, a little devil pops up. That's his id. That's a lot of poor choices and immoral choices. And that's the part of him, the animalistic part, that encouraged him to take advantage of the situation. And that would have been unethical and harmful. And the little angel pops up on his other shoulder and says, "You're a nice person. You're a moral person. Do the right thing. Take her home." And that's what he ended up doing, took her home to her parents. His head, so that angel, was the superego, our conscience, our moral identity. And his head was in the middle of the id and the superego, and that's his ego. And when there's a struggle between the id and the superego, that creates anxiety in our egos. So that's his belief of the structure of the id, ego, and superego. The thing is, even if we find some of these things primitive today, it encouraged others to look more into things like human growth and development. And the theories grew and expanded and became more accurate. He believed that these issues in one's personality development are primarily based in our first years of life, perhaps the first 6 years of life. And now we know that, we grow and develop throughout the entire lifespan. We also know that he only took his human development theory to adolescence, to the age of 12 or 13, whereas Erickson encouraged him to take it throughout the lifespan and to look at other areas other than just sexuality. Not everything is caused by human sexuality. So Erickson's theory became much more popular and more accurate, and it spanned the entire lifespan, not just up to adolescence. So as I talk about his psychosexual theory of human growth and development, the stages of development, please, if you're watching this on video, it is not a discussion for children. I'm going to use some pertinent examples, but you need to be an adult to hear them. So I remember one of my students saying, Grafton, I love your videos. Your voice just puts my kids to sleep. I'm like, well, that's great. Don't let them watch the Freud videos. So all right. So, my disclaimer is no, Grafton doesn't always talk about sex. It just happens to be Freud. So he followed what's called the medical model. Being a physician, he thought that was appropriate. And so the medical model has 4 parts. The first part is to diagnose the problem. The second part, prescribe a treatment, just like you would prescribe a medicine, only it's a psychological treatment. Third part, treat the patient. And the last part, cure the patient. So 4 steps based on the medical model of a physician. He was a physician, so it makes sense to him. I think that most psychologists or counselors today would believe that there was equality between a therapist and a client. And so we are equal as human beings. It's just that I happen to have some training in counseling, and maybe my client has expertise in something else. Maybe they have expertise in computers or, plumbing or electricians or something like that, something that I wouldn't know much about. So we each have our skills and our abilities, but we're equal as human beings. I just have some training in counseling. I'm going to do my best to help them in any way I can. Whereas the medical model really places some dominance on one individual. So more importance. They see them as the expert. And that's why he felt it was fine for the therapist to interpret things for the client, because the therapist would know best. Whereas I believe that it's important to facilitate awareness so the client can make their own interpretation. So let's look at the psychosexual stages of development. And if anybody has any examples, maybe you have kids, or maybe you remember when you were a child, but it's okay if they're funny. Okay, and please excuse my examples for their focus on sexuality. All right, so he goes from birth to the age of 12 or 13, and the stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. We'll talk a little bit about each one. The oral stage, and in the Corey book, whatever version you have, he always includes a table comparing Freud stages with Erikson stages. So the ages of each stage are pretty comparable. However, the stages themselves have a very different focus, but you can compare the two. So the first stage is the oral stage. It's basically focuses on sucking impulses for both hunger and pleasure needs of the child. It's a natural, instinctual response. Freud believed that society would not acknowledge infantile sexuality because of cultural taboos. I think that's a little extreme. I think he's over-sexualizing things here. I think this is a natural impulse for any child between the ages of birth and 1. And so what he saw as sexual, just in having 4 kids myself, um, you know, think about when a child is born and, um, you know, uh, whether they're breastfeeding or you're giving them a bottle, you're holding them, they feel safe, they develop trust, they're comforted if they are crying, perhaps they are uncomfortable if they are hungry, they're getting that need met by being fed. And so he's witnessing all this, but he's placing his own interpretation onto these perfectly natural and innocent occurrences in a child's life. Just an example of the sucking impulse, and that is, innate. It's not something that we learn. It's instinctual. One of my friends has been bald since high school, and each of my kids, he thinks it's a great game for me to hold the baby up, and he gets stuck to his head, because of this impulse. But other easily recognizable things are kids sucking their thumbs, or a pacifier, or something like that. There are some subcategories within the oral stage. One is called oral incorporative, and this is basically the pleasurable stimulation of the mouth, but if deprived of this, oral fixations might result later in life. So most of you have probably heard that phrase, oral fixation. An example would be Freud's own fixation with cigars. And he eventually died of cancer of the jaw and had a lot of suffering involved in that. I did not place any stock in Freud's stages of development when I was a counseling student. But when I became a therapist and had a private practice, I was one of the few male therapists in the small town where I had a practice. And I had a play therapy room, and I had a counseling office. And I saw a lot of children who had experienced some form of physical or sexual abuse. And if they were young, like 10 years old, we would do play therapy work. One of the things that astonished me was that as we developed a trusting relationship and they felt comfortable in that play therapy environment, they would move through different phases in the play therapy room. And one of the first things they would do is regress to an earlier stage of development. And almost every time it was the stage of documented abuse. So what they needed to do was they needed to work through that stage in an environment that was safe and loving and acceptable, where there was no abuse. And so they might regress to acting like a baby or pretending to drink a bottle or something like that. Sometimes they would act things out with dolls, or they would become the nurturing parent with a baby doll. So I always thought that it was interesting that they needed to relive that horrifying stage in a safe and accepting environment. And then once they move through it, it might take a month, it might take 2 months. They would move on to the next stage in their play. Another substage would be oral aggressive, and that's really with teething and biting. And if deprived of this in early life, adults may use sarcasm or biting comments. So when I learned about this, I go to my mother. I'm like, did you deprive me of teething? And she's like, yes, I didn't want any of my children carrying around a pacifier. So I blame my sarcasm on her. Any examples of the oral stage? Any oral fixations? People bite their nails, they might bite a pencil, glasses, might chew on the end of a glasses. Nobody sarcastic? Come on. All right. It is 5:25. I am going to pause the recording. Okay, so let's continue with Freud. And so the next stage is the anal stage. We call it this because it's a time when kids usually go through potty training, toilet training, from 1 to 3 years old. And so children become interested in feces because they create it, it comes from them. And I had a client, and I guess he was about 10, and he had been abused when he was a younger child, and he had a great foster family, and they were going to adopt him, and foster parents came to therapy with him, and he was really doing well, and he was in play therapy and in school, and he was abused originally during this stage, the anal stage. I get a panicked call from the foster parents one day, and they were exasperated, and they're like, I can't believe what this child has done. They painted the bathroom with their feces. What are we gonna do? And I said, wow, that's amazing. And they're like, it's not that amazing. And I said, it is. He has regressed from 10 to the age that he was abused. And it means, because a 3-year-old sometimes does that, and it means that he was ready to process the abuse and move forward. And part of it might have been because of therapy, but a large part of it is because he had been placed with a loving family that gave him unconditional love and acceptance, where he felt safe enough to regress and work through those stages, even if it was unconscious. So, we decided that, well, let's not make a big deal out of it. Let's just provide an appropriate consequence, which was cleaning up the mess. And it only happened one other time, and he moved on. But I saw that as kind of a breakthrough in therapy, where the foster parents were somewhat horrified. But sometimes children go to the bathroom inappropriately. Like one of my friend's kids, they they had company over, and the child wasn't getting any attention. Well, that child knew that they would get attention if they went to the bathroom in the middle of the living room, and they did. I had another friend, and my friend was very anal retentive, very organized and anxious, and he was becoming a social worker. And at that time in my life, it's like we all lived in a community and we all kind of helped each other out, and we all took care of his kid. And so if he had to go to class or work, one of us would watch his daughter, Catherine. And so he did not want his daughter to feel anxious or anal retentive like he did. So, being a social worker, he bought all these self-help books, and for their bedtime story, he would read, books on going and using the potty, things like that. He called me up. He said, "Grafton, get over here. I have to show you something." So I ran over. I thought something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. He knocked on the bathroom door, asked Catherine if she was decent, and she said yes. So we opened the door, and he's like, "Show Grafton." And she's like, she flushed the toilet, and she waved goodbye, and she says, "Bye-bye, Poopy." And Dan was so happy because that was the last page of the potty training book that they had read every night. And he felt as though, wow, this is great. She won't be anal retentive or anxious at all. But in reality, we know it's not just about going to the bathroom, it's about a parenting style. And Dan was anxious throughout his entire parenting. So, yeah, it didn't work out quite as well as he thought. But so anal aggressiveness is when harsh methods are used to toilet train a child, or too much importance or emphasis is placed on it, or perhaps they're not ready yet. And they may later display anger, aggression, or anal retentiveness. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm so OCD." Well, they're not OCD, they're just anal retentive. So there is a leaning towards control or perfectionism, or organization or orderliness. But really it's about having an individual's own control over their environment and what's going to happen. Anybody have any stories about that? Go ahead.
I actually worked as a case manager when I was training the person I was shadowing. They had a family where their adopted son did the same thing. He painted the wall with feces. Unfortunately, they did not have a therapist to tell them, "Hey, this is great. This is a good breakthrough." Their family handled it not the way it should have. And so I was just thinking, I was like, man, I wonder. Again, it wasn't even my case though, but I wonder what would happen had somebody stepped in and been like, "This is why that's happening. It's not because they want to make your bath disgusting and gross. They're working through something."
Yeah. And you know what? It's kind of normal for somebody to respond in a negative way, but that kind of moves everything backwards a little bit, because here they were in a trusting, loving environment, and the parents freak out, and it just kind of does the opposite. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, the next stage is the Phalic stage. It's a period of walking, talking, thinking independently, controlling the sphincters, being able to go to the bathroom on their own, paying new attention to genitalia. So when we think about this age, when we think about 3 years old to 6 years old, I've seen this with my own kids, and it's not about sexuality. Like, it's not sexual interest or sexual pleasure or anything like that. It's simply about self-exploration and discovery. You know, one gender has, you know, certain things and another gender has another. Or think about it, they wore diapers all the way up to being potty trained, and now they're not wearing diapers and they're going to the bathroom themselves and they're learning to take a bath by themselves. And it's simply a matter of discovery. They're not really at that adolescent stage yet. But Freud really misinterpreted this self-exploration and discovery and saw everything from a sexualized standpoint. These things do occur. More attention is paid, but not for the same reasons that Freud thought. But this is also the stage where Freud came up with the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. The Oedipus complex is when Freud believed, that a young male child falls in love with his mother in a sexualized way. But then later on believes that the father is jealous and fears castration, and then begins paying more attention to the father. Well, this is just crazy, in my own opinion, but I can see why, from Freud's slanted sexualized viewpoint, he might have come up with this, because all the way up until the age of 3, and of course, this is from a male-female standpoint. A lot of times people are single parents. You could have, all types of gender identity. I think it would work the same way no matter what gender identity people were. So, I have friends, 2 male fathers, and I think it would work the same way if one parent was a primary caregiver and the other parent was working. I don't think it has so much to do with male-female identity. But in my own family, my wife stayed at home and took care of the kids, and the kids really bonded with her because that's who they were with. That's who was loving and caring and holding them and helping them when they got hurt and feeding them and everything else. But during this stage, when they were getting a little older, they were like, who's this guy? Call him Dad? What's he do during the day? Maybe I'll check him out for a little while. Maybe he'll get me out of the house. Maybe I'll get to explore a little more, see what's up with that. So their focus changed a little bit. They had a little more interest in what I was doing and who I was. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that's where it comes from. But I think the term like mama's boy or whatever, I think that comes from if the stage between 0 and 3 lasts longer. So if they're like 4 or 5 and still displaying the same, I guess it's like lack of detachment. So, I think that's why. So if they have trouble leaving mom, and going to school or something like that. And the Electra complex is the opposite. But once again, I think it has more to do with attachment and bonding and then exploration. And I don't think male, female roles have as much to do with it as whoever the primary caregiver is. I think that's who they're going to bond with first. And then a lot of sexual identification patterns can take place. So because I worked with so many children who were abused or had different issues, I read a lot and studied a lot. And then later, I worked with individuals who wanted to go through sex changes. And so I did a lot of research on this, had a lot of supervision on this. So one of the myths is that sexually abused children that sexual abuse may cause problems with gender identity. It does not. So it doesn't matter whether a male child is abused by a male, or female child is abused by a female, or a female child's abused by a male, or male child's abused by a female, or with any of them are abused by any part of the LGBTQ. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect an individual's gender identity. That is not changed by abuse. And they've done all kinds of different research and studies on this. But that's a myth that's perpetuated by bias. What it does do, what any kind of abuse does, and once again, it doesn't matter abuse by who, but any type of abuse, sexual abuse, it causes gender role confusion. And what that is that when a child gets older, it's not that their gender identity has changed in any way. It's just that they experience more anxiety during that time of their life as they are discovering their own identity. And that just means that they need to process the abuse more. Another example of the Phalic stage, and once again, this is a legitimate example. It just happens to be about human sexuality, but it happens all the time. So when I was a school counselor, I was an elementary school counselor, and I had first worked with all kinds of kids, in a private practice. Then I became a school counselor in an elementary school. So I was a little more familiar with certain childhood issues than the average school counselor. So teacher came running down to my office, and she didn't know what to do. One of her students was masturbating in the middle of class and happened to be a female. And so I went and just sat in the back of the class, and I said, well, I'm observing your teacher. And all the kids were used to hearing that. And I realized that none of the other kids noticed. And I also noticed that it only occurred during times that anxiety was heightened, like if she didn't have her homework done, or if there was a test or an exam or a quiz that she wasn't prepared for. So somehow, by chance, this child had discovered a way to relieve her anxiety. And so we contacted the parents, had a physical exam. Nothing was wrong. She hadn't been abused. There was no physical problem or anything like that. So I said, well, let's not call attention to this. Let's not make this into a negative thing, so that later on, this is just part of human development. So I went and I talked to the entire class about study skills, about, reducing anxiety. And I said that every child could bring in their favorite stuffed animal. And when they felt anxious or nervous, they could hold the stuffed animal in their lap and they could pet the stuffed animal. And that would help them to calm down and relieve anxiety. And also being prepared, having your homework done, being prepared for a quiz, things like that. The combination will considerably lower their anxiety. The teacher thought it was interesting because she knew everybody who wasn't prepared for their homework or exam, because they were all holding their stuffed animals, petting their stuffed animal. Over a few weeks of doing this, the behavior was extinguished naturally without calling any attention to it. And I thought that was a very healthy way of doing it. If it wouldn't have worked, we probably would have had to talk with her about privacy. But we wanted to extinguish this behavior in the most positive way possible. I used to teach the course on human growth and development, only when I started teaching that course, I didn't have any kids of my own. I only had cats. So I used my cats for all the examples of human growth and development. And I had, if you ever work for an elementary school, you're going to end up with a bunch of cats because, somebody's cat has kittens. And if you're living in the country, you walk into the school and cats are screaming in somebody's locker. And you got to get the janitor to unlock them. And there's all these kittens in a bucket and the kid's crying, my daddy's going to drown them if somebody doesn't take the kittens. And so you end up taking a cat home. So I ended up with 2 cats. And then that happened in the elementary school. I ended up bringing home a 3rd cat, Cosmo. And so the other cats were neutered, and they had been with me for a while, but Cosmo was attracted to the other cats, so I knew it was time to take him to the vets. So had him neutered, and after he had recovered, he went back to the same behavior, and the other cats were bothered by his aggression. And I called the vet and I'm like, my cat is displaying all this sexual aggression with my other cats. We just had him neutered. What's going on? Could you have missed something? It's like, no, this is brain chemicals. This is one way this cat shows he's the head of the cat pack. And so he's probably the leader. And I said, well, what can we do about it? And the vet's like, well, we do have kitty Prozac. And I'm like, I am not putting my cat on Prozac. And so I said, I'll figure something out. So I figured if it worked with a 3rd grader, it might work with my cat. So I go to the toy store to look at stuffed animals for my cat. It was the exact same time that the new movie 101 Dalmatians came out. So there were no stuffed kittens. So I'm thinking to myself, if I bring him home a puppy, is that going to damage him in any way psychologically? And I'm like, no, he's never leaving the apartment. I'll get him a dog. So I gave him the 101 Dalmatian. They bonded. It kept him away from the other cats. And just an example of substitution. Any stories on that stage? All right. I think that's the most interesting stories I got for you. All right, next stage, latency. And the latency stage, 6 to 12. So all the way up to puberty and the genital stage. So latency stage is Freud believed that kids entered into a stage of narcissistic orientation, lowered sexuality, children develop more same-gendered bonds. This makes a lot of sense because this is also the time they're in middle school, they're out at recess, they're eating with each other at lunch, they develop friendships, and so I think that's a pretty normal progression. The last stage is the genital stage, and once somebody reaches puberty, this is when sexuality begins to evolve more. So this is probably the most accurate thing Freud has to say as far as human sexuality. So he ends the stages of development here. Now, at age 13 or so, if you weren't in school, you were probably going to be an apprentice or learn a skill or work on a farm or something like that during this time period. So he saw this as the beginning of adulthood, even though it's a very young age for us today. Now, we do teach a course on human sexuality. Dr. Gruber usually teaches it during a winter semester. It was required when I had a master's degree, so I took that course, but it's no longer required as a separate course by KCREP, so we don't make it a requirement anymore. However, some states do require a course in counseling and human sexuality, and I think it's an excellent course. So if you're interested in moving to another state and getting a license in another state, like South Carolina, Florida, someplace like that, check what the requirements are for an LPC in those other states. And if human sexuality and counseling is a requirement, we offer it every other year so that everybody has a chance to take it who plans on moving to one of those other states that require it. I think Dr. Gruber is going to try to teach it this winter. And if not, it'll be the next winter, but you should all be able to take it. Just a few more things about Freud. Freud paid a lot of attention to anxiety. He had a lot of anxiety. Once again, this is a conflict between the id and the superego, and the ego struggles to make some type of moral decision. A lot of you may have heard that Freud was a cocaine addict, and I just want to give you the real story behind that. So, being a medical doctor as well as a psychoanalyst, at this time period, cocaine was first being refined, and it was introduced to the medical profession. It eventually became a drug, but when it was first introduced to society, it was seen as a wonder drug. In fact, it was in all kinds of medicines. It was in, cough syrups. It was in colas. It was in all kinds of things. But Freud first saw it as a wonder drug. He could think clearly. He could work for hours, Then he ran out, and he realized that he felt a very strong need, and he went through some minor withdrawal, and he realized that it could create an addiction. He already had an addiction to nicotine, and he didn't want another addiction. And this was, a fairly strong addiction that he was developing. And so he quit cold turkey and never went back. So yeah, it's true, but it was kind of a discovery of the times. Another drug that was in a lot of medicine was heroin. That was being refined at the same time as cocaine, both seen as wonder drugs during that time period. So that's the story behind that. But the medical profession still uses cocaine. Anybody know how they use it? Yeah.
It's usually like that. You can also use it.
Yeah. So specifically an aesthetic for eye surgery. Yeah, that's right. All right. So let's talk briefly about defense mechanisms. I think these were pretty on target, the defense mechanisms. I see them today all the time. And one of the interesting things is that when I learned about the defense mechanisms, the first person I saw them in was myself. And then, of course, I saw them in everybody else. But I tried to do away with them in myself. Defense mechanisms are not healthy coping mechanisms. They are unhealthy coping mechanisms. When you take the diagnosis class, the DSM class, the first thing you're going to think about every diagnosis is that you have it. The second thing you're going to think once you realize you don't have it is that your family members have it. So then you're going to kind of put it in a better perspective, whatever the diagnosis is. All right, so let's just go over the defense mechanisms. I tried to shorten the definition to one sentence for each one. So repression, the anxiety-producing thoughts are excluded from consciousness. So many early childhood memories or events may be excluded from consciousness. Denial, maybe you've heard that phrase, he's paddling up a river called denial. Distortion of reality, thoughts, feelings, or perceptions that produce anxiety. So the difference between repression and denial is repression, thoughts or events or memories are excluded. Denial, reality, thoughts, feelings, perceptions are distorted. So they're not excluded, they're distorted. That's the difference. Reaction formation, to actively form and express actions opposite to impulses one actually experiences. So being kind when somebody's feeling angry. My mom used to have reaction formation sometimes when I would bring home a date. And if my mom liked the person, she would treat that person like a member of the family normally. But if my mother didn't like my date, she would be super nice. So it was almost the opposite reaction to how she really felt. Projection, attributing aspects of one's own personality to others. So never define a word by a form of itself. So you can't say projection is projecting aspects. Projection is attributing aspects of one's own personality to others. Displacement is redirecting impulses from an unsafe target onto a safe target, but inappropriate. It's like if somebody is angry at their boss, they'll come home and mistreat the dog, something like that, or the spouse, as the case may be. Rationalization, manufacturing reasons to justify anxiety-producing situations. It's like sour grapes. Sublimation, diverting unacceptable impulses, sexual or aggressive, into more acceptable behaviors, like maybe some type of athletics or art. Regression, reverting back to a previous stage of development. We talked about that in the stages of development. My examples of play therapy. Introjection, conforming to the standards or values of others. Identification, allying with others or organizations to protect one's self-worth, like joining a fraternity or sorority. Compensation, concentrating on positive traits to mask perceived weaknesses. It refocuses others' attention. An example of overcompensation might be, if somebody didn't like how they looked, they may try to overcompensate by working out or something like that. Just a couple other things. Transference and countertransference. So transference, the client's unconscious shifting to the analyst of feelings and fantasies that are reactions to significant others in the client's past. Transference, an example of that would be if my client's father had been an alcoholic and became angry or aggressive when he drank, and maybe my client saw me as a male of the same age and appearance as the father, and the client would start feeling anger or fear towards me for no apparent reason. That could be a transference of emotions from events in the past with the client's father to me. That's okay as long as I realize what's happening, we can process it. What's not okay is countertransference, and that's when a therapist begins to experience emotions and directs them to a client that are not appropriate. That's not okay. It means that we have some unfinished business or issues that have not been processed. We should go back into therapy. Some therapeutic interventions or techniques. Maintaining an analytic framework that is maintaining a routine. Free association, I say a word, you say the first thing that comes to your mind. Word association, I have a specific list of words. I read them and you respond with the first thing that comes to your mind. Slightly different. Earliest recollections, dream analysis. Interpretation is considered a technique. Let's see. We went through the criticisms, and you know what you're going to be doing for your discussion board. So any questions or comments? All right. If you do have questions, you start working on your videos and you have questions, just email me or ask me the next class. I'll help you out. If you want to make sure you're going in the right direction with a certain character, I can process that with you. And I will see you all next week.